Hi, and welcome to another episode of Silver Goose Farm Stories. I'm your host, Mama Goose. We had our first heat wave of the summer a couple of weeks ago, during which time my husband and I decided that it would be a good idea to get a little wading pool for our kids. In the past, we've always used sort of those little cheap plastic ones that you can pick up on a whim at like the Dollar General or Walmart or something, but this time we went for like a bigger option that the kids could actually kind of swim around in. And so it ended up coming, and on a super hot day we got it all set up, and the girls jumped in immediately and spent that first hot summer day in the water, just only coming out to get snacks or hydrate or go to the bathroom and then jumping right back in. The following day proved to be just as hot, and the kids were all ready to go bright and early in the morning with their swimsuits on. But then surprisingly, as the day went on, about mid-afternoon, these really ominous dark clouds sort of appeared on the horizon, and that was really interesting because here where we live is considered to be a high desert, and in the summertime we get almost zero rainfall. It's pretty much standard if you go about 3 months without any precipitation. So to see clouds and then to hear thunder was a little bit of an unusual occurrence. Obviously, when we heard thunder, we got the kids out of the water and we kind of watched, very perplexed, as a shower of really fat raindrops kind of appeared out of nowhere and just drenched the land for good like 5 minutes. It kind of reminds me of the summer thunderstorms that we used to have in Georgia as a kid, where it just kind of come out of nowhere and then disappear just as quickly. But this one included some really loud thunderclaps and just flashes of lightning. Lavelle decided that this would be the perfect time to have her calf. We had been just waiting for weeks now. My husband thought she'd be due last month, and I was pretty sure it was this month, but really a lightning storm was the ideal time for her to calve, I guess. The positive was that it wasn't as hot because the rain sort of broke the heat up, but then she also had her calf underneath a tree, so the worry was, would the calf get struck by lightning? Thankfully he didn't. The next thought that I have while seeing the lightning across the sky, even while enjoying the immediate cool off that the rain provided, was I hope that lightning doesn't cause any fires, because it had been so dry for so long. But sure enough, after the storm clouds passed and the rain stopped, it was just enough rain to get the ground wet for like that nice rain smell. But sure enough, right after that, my husband's Fire Watch app on his phone immediately started blasting these alerts as report after report of the little fires from lightning strikes against the mountainside began filtering in. The biggest fire immediately after the lightning storm was down the hill from us, and there were closer fires to us, but they weren't as critical at the time. I don't think they were threatening any structures, and that's really what the firefighters try to combat immediately. So they went down the hill on the main highway to deal with the more critical fires at the moment. But as fire proves to be a fickle thing, within hours, those sort of non-threatening fires that were closer along the main road up in the mountains, individually they were called the Bolt and the Flash fires, and then all of the fires that were involved because of that lightning storm are called the June Lightning Fire Complex. So one of the fires was called the Bolt fire, which became the biggest one at the time, went from 20 acres to over 1,000 acres within a matter of a few hours. Of course, when that happened, manpower was quickly diverted from the fires that were down the hill which were at that time then taken care of, they were contained at a higher percentage. So we started hearing helicopters overhead, and there just became like the constant background noise over the next few days of as planes were dumping water and fire retardant, and then of course that was the time when the electricity decided to cut out. So what was first a temporary relief from the summer heat had now become the cause of the fires, and then the stifling humidity that threatened to suffocate us in our homes that immediately followed, because we suddenly couldn't leave the windows open because the air was getting smokier by the minute. And if you didn't have a generator or solar, there was no way to alleviate that kind of dense blanket of hot that was settling on us. Thank God for the wading pool that we got, because while we didn't have power for a portion of our house, the kids were able to stay cool in the water for as long of a stretch as they could handle, given the air quality. And I would just sort of lay under the living room fan, which was on our solar system. The other things that are on our solar system include the fridges, the freezers, and the internet, and also a couple appliances in the kitchen, like the popcorn maker, because priorities. So I would just lay under the fan in the living room and try very, very hard not to go insane from the heat. There was no foreseeable time where power would come back, according to our PG&E reports, because the main roads up to our little mountain community were closed due to the fire. There had already been sort of a bottleneck of traffic before the fires in this stretch of road, because Caltrans has been working on widening that main thoroughfare. And for weeks, the heavy traffic of incoming summer tourists that are trying to get up to the national parks was causing this backlog of cars that doesn't normally happen up here in the mountains. And closing the roads because of the fire made it that much worse. The fire closed every access point up and down the mountain except for one of the windiest, most seldom used back roads on the mountain. So then you had a mix of tourists and residents were pretty much trapped or crawling down the hill along these hairpin turns on, to be honest, not a very well paved road. You had your city day trippers and vacationing international tourists driving alongside these giant logging trucks and semis and emergency vehicles all on the same road. And it would add like an hour to the trip. I think it was an hour and a half, maybe up and down the mountain, which was, I'm just thankful that I didn't have any reason to go and leave the house during this time. At dinner on the second day, my husband kind of quietly told me afterwards, after the kids had run off into the living room, that we should maybe start making a list of all the things we'd want to ready in case we'd have to go. And I was a little bit confused when I heard this, because the last time this area had to be evacuated, it was about 10 years ago, and the fire that was enormous, and you could see fire along the ridge of the mountains behind our house. The danger was imminently palpable. And there have been some years while we've been living here where the wildfires are so bad that the sky is literally just orange and gray. And there's ash raining down constantly throughout the day. And even then we were never given any reports that we would have to prepare for evacuation. This fire was a big one. I'm not going to deny that, but it was further away than those fires had been. But suddenly we were in this yellow zone, which meant to be prepared for the possibility. So it was smoky and it was big and it was a concern, but I couldn't see how this was any more dangerous than any of the other previous years. But my husband showed me the maps on the phone where you could see how the fire has progressed over the course of a few hours, how it went from 20 acres and then to 1,000 acres, 3,500 acres, 5,500 acres, and then 6,500 acres with minimal containment for the 2 days. I think it never got any more than 10% contained that entire time. We have friends that live within the very center of that kind of red angry patch on the map, and it was basically the entire main freeway or highway. They had already been told by the sheriffs to leave, even though you do, as an adult, have the choice to stay at your home, even if you're told to evacuate. Not a lot of people in the mountain areas have fire insurance, whether they were dropped by their carriers or the premiums became too high or it's just not offered anymore because, politics. And so you staying on your property is basically the only kind of fire insurance that you have. We spent that night noting all of the essentials that we would want to grab and kind of making a list. And I went around taking pictures of our incredibly messy house because at this point we've also been without power and just, it's amazing how many tasks require water and electricity in order to get done. And we were kind of living in the middle of that pause. But we went around taking pictures of our house and our farm just in case we needed some sort of reference photos. And we spent a good portion of the night calling and texting everyone we knew in the red evacuation go zone, asking where they were, what they needed, if they were safe. The quiet moments of the night that we had were interrupted by static radio calls because my husband had those public service communication lines up on his phone so we could listen to what was happening in real time. And also occasionally an alert would blast giving us the newest data points on how many acres the fire had gotten to now, what was the containment, which was still the same. It was just growing and not being contained. And any news updates about the fire and about evacuation orders. Surprisingly, the list that my husband and I made was not that long. A few essentials, some important documents, like a small bag of irreplaceable family heirlooms and some change of clothes, but everything else, I think if I had time and space, I could pack and hoard more. But I think in these sort of situations, my husband and I sort of have this really very calculated and logical way of processing and organizing and information and just categorizing how we're supposed to proceed. And so that really helped keep that whole list making and packing pretty simple. I'd also want to make a note about how much I admired the way that our neighborhood responded to the fire. I think everybody who lives here after a few years is kind of a veteran to wildfires. The mountain community has kind of grown a lot in the last couple of years. A lot of people have left the city and bought property up here because one, it's cheaper than living in the city, albeit with some, difficulties. And two, you're kind of remote and apart from the rest of what people think is California. Living up here in the mountains is very different from that, stereotypical impression. But I really loved the way that everyone kind of rallied together. There's forums online that I'm a part of that just post news about the community, and all during the time of the Bolt fire crisis, every a couple of minutes someone would post, here at this person's house, you could see the flames here, and they'd post pictures, and people would post where the Red Cross had set up for people who are evacuating, where you could take your animals if you needed to remove them. There was this guy who called himself Cowboy 911, and he posted his photo and his and his phone number, and he said that he has a big stock trailer, so he'd come and get your large animals and take them somewhere safe. Like the Tractor Supply delivery guy was toting up like bottles of water and food and delivering them to people, and there were the local like handyman and contractors were offering like their tractors to like build or to make the fire lines, to check on shut-ins. The local like pump people were going around making sure that people had running water and like helping set up generators, and it was just this amazing like community rallying point. That's always true of every fire, but I just really appreciated the way that everyone responded as a community. There wasn't a lot of negativity. It was mainly just like providing information, providing services, providing charity. Like, you know, one person was like, hey, I have electricity, I have solar, so if you need to come and get in an air-conditioned room for a little bit or to charge your phones or something, like my house is open to you. Like, who does that in the city, really? But that happens on a regular basis here in the mountains. A few of our friends had to leave their homes, but they thankfully they had a safe place to stay. And we had a couple of discussions about figuring out a way that we could host other people's livestock on our property, just in case for friends. And then we were also busy making sure that like our parents had electricity and like my husband was carting generators around and working on the electrical at our house because we were having trouble with that too. But thankfully, like, everyone's animals were okay where they were. There wasn't anything imminently dangerous that happened to them. So I mentioned before that our house is on solar for a good portion of what we use. Our well pump is still on a separate meter, and so when we don't have power, we don't have water still. We're trying to figure out a solution for that, obviously, but at that point in time we didn't have water. A couple times a day my husband would go out and plug our generator into I don't know the jargon. He'd just plug it in and run the pump, and we would go and hurriedly like do all the things that we had been waiting all day for, like making sure the animals had their water topped off and flushing toilets and filling up a lot of jars and buckets and things with water so that we had stuff to use during the day. And then like, you know, my husband was working outside and like crawling around in the attic, so he would just rinse off really quick in the shower. But the fire didn't seem like it was getting any smaller. It just kept growing and growing. We kept watching the number of acres get bigger. And the fire at this point had merged with another fire that was close to it, that was also nearby. And so it had gotten so big that it was whipping the air up into these little tornadoes, twisters of fire. And the sky kept getting grayer and thicker, and the sun would kind of filter through it during the day and give everything this really orange, like apocalyptic hue. And in the evening, it would just blaze like this, like bloody red. On the afternoon of the second day, our generator stopped working because the air was too smoky and it kept tripping the carbon monoxide sensor on the engine. I guess it was too smart for its own good. So we would have to make do with what water we had collected from the previous time the generator had started, and just hope that the power would return before that water supply ran out. Now, we weren't completely without water because we do live on the same property as our in-laws, or my in-laws, and they have a well pump that's on solar, which is something that we're considering doing ourselves, but that would have meant like trekking back and forth between their pump and our house with like fivers of water, which is doable. It's just not fun when it's 100 degrees outside also. I was very concerned about the state of my garden because at this point all the water had been turned off to conserve what we did have. And, you know, plants don't survive very well without water in extreme heat. And so I was just kind of watching the the very small amount of progress that we made this new year just kind of wilting away before my eyes. But yeah, we just kind of kept every alert that our phones would tell us had us staring at this map that kept growing and growing. The number of acres kept getting larger. Our house was right next to the evacuation zone, and thankfully that never changed. We spent a lot of time praying and asking for prayers, and then the next day our power came back on kind of suddenly. It got pushed back from an estimated time point, and it got pushed back until the evening of that day, but thankfully it did. And our power came back, and at that point it also seemed like the fire had made a standstill. It wasn't progressing any further. Thankfully it didn't jump the highway, because that would have been devastating. It stayed on one side, and our power came back. Our evacuation status dropped one level, so now we were in green instead of yellow. And then the evacuation warnings were lifted for everybody who had been living in the red zone. So people our friends could return back to their homes. And life seemed to return back to some form of normal. Although the air is still pretty smoky, because the basin fire, which also started a day into the Bolt fire, was now raging. I guess the manpower that had been working on the Bolt fire that was threatening a lot of structures, and because it was right in the middle of quote unquote downtown Squaw Valley, they were moved to go tackle the basin fire, which was happening further behind us in the mountains. I think initial reports, I remember that it was threatening a lot of like campers, because it was closer to the park. It was in the mountains. And so a lot of tourists and campgrounds had to be evacuated. But that fire is still raging. It's bigger than what the Bolt fire was at its biggest. It's now, at last count, I believe it's over 13,000 acres, and the zones that are requiring evacuating keep getting bigger. Even though it's by far one of the bigger fires that this area has had this year, it seems to be an entire world away, just because it's no longer threatening like people or anybody that I know actively. The firefighters are still working around the clock. Our Firewatch app still like pings every couple of hours to give us updates. And you can still hear the helicopters that fly overhead. And we've got patchy power outages that go in and out because of the infrastructure like insecurities that are happening because of this crisis. And this is only the beginning of July. Wildfire season goes well into the end of August and even into September. Last year, the first rain didn't come until middle of November. So that's a long time to be exposed to the potential of some massive fires, because the ground gets so dry here. I am so very grateful that there was minimal structural damage. I was driving up and down the road, up and down the hill these last couple of days for a bunch of different errands and things. And it was my first time being out of the house since the fire, but also like seeing like the devastation of it. Before, on both the left and right hand sides of the road as you go down the hill, it's just these like rolling hillside and huge cow pastures and a lot of like oak trees, and now the left side of the road is still the same, but the right side of the road as you go down the mountain is just charred to a crisp. Like you could see the bulldozer lines that were made as fire retention, and where the places where the flames jumped across that, and just the trees that have been charred to trunks, and then these like red streaks all along the mountainside of where the fire retardant had just been poured to keep the flames from traveling. But it goes all the way down the hill, which is a good 30 minutes of driving on highway speeds. Like, can you just, what is that? Like 40 miles of road that stretches on, that's just covered and charred and black. At the very bottom in Fresno, if you look towards the mountain range where we live, you can just see the black like smoking remnants of this fire. It's devastating. And I'm so grateful for the firefighters that put their lives on the line in order to help us, to save us. Please continue to keep them in your prayers. They are still working. They are still fighting the fires, and hopefully the not so many fires that can come and that are coming this season, and especially for their families that are waiting for them at home. And I pray for all of you. I know it's a big scare to like people who are visiting the mountains, especially if you went up to the park and then got trapped there for some unknown amount of time. And anyone who's experiencing a wildfire or power outage, or kind of like feeling a little bit cut off from the world because of a natural disaster, like I really feel for you, because that experience is it's dramatic, to put it lightly. But hopefully the fire season will be short and the rains will come early. And I pray that you all stay safe and healthy and happy. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Silver Goose Farm Stories. I'm always happy for anyone to take the time to listen. If you'd like to hear or learn more about our farm, you can join us on our website at silvergoosefamilyfarm.com, or you can follow us on our Instagram, the same handle, Silver Goose Family Farm. Thank you again, and I hope to be back with you soon. Bye.